I've just been reviewing the Mark Lundy case. Now, his arrest and trial happened a couple of years before the New Zealand Supreme Court was formed, legislation and stuff coming through. And so he had an appeal to the Privy Council, which said that it was quashed and that a retrial would happen. The evidence that came from the pathologist had no time of death, and there's a number of different ways that the time of death can be worked out in the human body. One is you can put a thermometer in and then you time it, and then you take the temperature a second time, and so you're able to put that onto a graph, and then you can work out the amount of heat that's released, and that gives you tracking back. And there are other things, you can do some things with the eyes and bits and pieces. What happened is there was only one bit of discredited information around stomach content, and so basically there was no time of death at all within a period of time from say 7 one night and 9 a.m. the next, so a 14-hour window. And so the first trial focused on a 7 a.m. death, and then the second trial a time after that. What I find interesting and is the fact that there were other witnesses, not so much witnesses, but suspects, and they were dismissed and not re-interviewed. So the first ones were dismissed because if they had an alibi at 7 at night, they were dismissed. And then when the second trial came around, they weren't put back in place with regards to a later time frame. So that was another difficulty. And there was some forensic evidence with regards to hair and skin samples under the nails, which happens in a fight. And so obviously there's a fight that's happened. And then there was a couple of characters that had extorted some $16,000 for a $2 million fine to set up a vineyard. And so there's obviously some stress around that. One of the things that's come up with electronic signatures is the use of the electronic signature to get out. And we're seeing these sunset clauses in contracts at the moment where a house will be signed up and then a year later a $500,000 house is now worth $750,000, and so the person gets gives back the deposit and then regains the house, which is then finished and then on sold for another couple of $100,000 more, and the poor people that have signed up for it with a 3-month sunset clause have lost out. And so I'm just applying that to a $2 million vineyard project, and if there was any people around at that time that wanted that deal to go through or to go forward or whatever, and so it just adds a complicating factor. It seems that there could have been a couple of people involved with regards to breaking into a house and bludgeoning a couple of people to death, which was a tragic situation. And so that, similar to the Arthur Allen Thomas case, when the Prime Minister, Rob Muldoon, 160 IQ, gave a pardon through the Governor-General, and then they went through a Royal Commission. We're in a similar situation with the Lundy case, and one of the challenges is the third trial didn't go ahead because the Supreme Court turned it down. And so here we are in a situation where we've got away from the Privy Council. It said, hey, look, this, from the reading of the matter, there's some issues here. Go back, very much like what Muldoon did. And then our Supreme Court, for some reason, didn't allow a third trial, which would have then raised not at 7 the death and not within that 14 hours. And so these other suspects would have been brought up with the third trial, or the police would have gone back and had a look at those various things. So for me, it's a fascinating case. So we've got a person that's going to speak a little bit about it, and we'll just play that now.
If not Mark, then who? And I'm so glad you asked. Like I said, Mark was the police's prime suspect from the very beginning. And that's not just me saying that. During the arrest interview, one of the detectives turned to him and said, and I quote, "If you want to know what we've been doing for 6 months, we've been working on you, all right? For 6 months from day one, the number one suspect on my spreadsheet is you." And so a lot of people seem to take this as Mark being the police's only suspect, but that is so far from the truth. The police's original suspect list was about 60 names long, and 55 of those suspects were ruled out during the original investigation based solely on the original 7 p.m. time of death. And as far as I can tell, police never revisited these suspects once that time of death changed. One of the suspects was 49-year-old Sheridan Murphy, who police discovered had been really very close to Christine, to the point where there were rumours floating around that there was something going on between them. But, I mean, it could just be rumours. Except that despite Mark testifying that he and Christine hadn't been intimate in several months before she was murdered, there was a pregnancy test found in their bedroom, and 5 days after the murders, Sheridan Murphy ended his own life. Another one of the suspects, whose name has been suppressed, lived in the same suburb as the Lundys at the time of the murders and had a history of multiple convictions, including one for wounding with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. And police were told that this man was believed to have something against Christine, but this man had an alibi for 7 p.m, so he was ruled out. One thing that was revealed at Mark's second trial was that 21 hairs had been found entwined around Christine's hands. The logical explanation, considering the defense wounds she had on her hands and forearms, was that Christine had clearly struggled against her attacker and apparently in the process grabbed a bunch of their hair. Like groundbreaking stuff, right? But neither the Crown or the defense paid a lot of attention to these hairs at trial because, as it turns out, after Christine's autopsy, these hairs were sent for testing, but they just sat there in the lab for 9 months, despite Mark having voluntarily handed over samples of his own hair to test them against, and the hairs were then returned to police in 2001 untested. After his first trial in 2002, Mark wrote the police more than once requesting that all of the material and evidence from his case be preserved and that they return to him anything that they didn't require. But in 2003, police destroyed these hairs that had clearly belonged to Christine's murderer. They were destroyed without ever having been tested. There was, however, also several unidentified fingerprints, 2 palm prints, and some footprints that were found at the crime scene that were found not to be a match for Mark, as well as unknown male DNA, again, not a match for Mark, found under both Christine and Amber's fingernails. Then there is Glenn Weggery, Christine's brother, who was first on scene and discovered the bodies on the morning of the 30th of August. Glenn had a cut on his nose that he had no explanation for when questioned by police, and when 2 of his cars were examined, there was blood found throughout both of them, including the boot. Now, this blood in the cars was not a match for Christine or Amber's DNA, but the trace amounts of blood found in his bathroom, on a handkerchief in his house, and a pair of his underwear were found to be an 83% match to Christine's DNA and an 88% match for Amber's. At the 2015 trial, Glenn seriously copped it on the stand. Like, he was straight up accused by Mark's lawyers of having an inappropriate relationship with Amber and committing the murders themselves. Also, during an interview very early on in the investigation, the police had also accused Glenn of committing the murders, saying that they found it strange that rather than rushing to Amber's side when he saw her lying there covered in blood, he had instead picked up the phone and made that emergency phone call. But the defense claimed at trial that by this point, the police were already suffering from serious tunnel vision for Mark, and so they never really pursued Glenn like they should have. Finally, it was revealed last year that on the day of the murders, literally just hours before Christine and Amber were killed, police were called out to the house of Mark's vineyard business associate because 2 big angry creditors had shown up and started threatening him. We're just going to call this business associate Mark's associate because his name has also been suppressed. But originally, these big, scary guys were like, you need to give us $16,000 right now. And when Mark's associate was like, I don't have any money, they tried to steal some expensive grapevine root cuttings, and so the associate had called the police. Apparently, though, the two officers that attended the scene to settle this dispute spoke with these two creditors and decided that it was just a civil commercial matter that didn't require police involvement, and didn't even bother to take any of their personal details, just left them to it. So the associate wrote them a check for the $16,000 and they left. If you're wondering, this associate is the same associate that Mark had called from his motel room in Petone the night of the murders, and this incident was what the whole phone call had been about. Mark's associate being like, yeah, these guys turned up and threatened me and tried to steal the root cuttings. But Mark's supporters are like, how did police not investigate this incident further after the murders? If these guys had shown up to this associate's house to aggressively chase up money, what if they had turned up to the Lundy's house that night to speak with Mark, but when they found out he wasn't there, things just went bad and got out of hand? On one final last side note, this associate was also on the police's suspect list, but once they zeroed in on Mark as being a murderer, they still suspected this guy of being involved in some way and offered him immunity from prosecution if he would admit to making an attempt to clean up the crime scene and turning off the computer at 10:52 p.m, but he refused, saying that he had nothing to do with the murders and he didn't believe that Mark did either. So it's time for fun.
So you can see how this Lundy case has created a situation where, from a scientific forensic perspective, the whole concept of a trial and then a retrial and certain weights of forensic information is then weighed up. So fingerprints and palm prints and hair and skin samples under, really, those are the most important parts of scientific investigation, tried and proven and been used many times before. So now we're in a situation where new forensic stuff, mRNA and other tests were used, and so they then fall out of, and never been used in any other cases. So this becomes a bit of a challenge. So I just raised this because we are looking at a criminal justice system which is moving into a solar system jurisprudence one where truth is the most important thing, and so there are questions that are raised, and I just wanted to give that information and let the comments show what you feel could have happened. My feelings, if I had to make if I was in the police's position and had to, from a suspect perspective, it would be go through the various suspects again with a 14-hour window rather than just the 7 a.m. or 7 p.m. window, so the 14 hours. So that would have been a way of looking at it, and spend a little bit more time, because the Vice Squad have three things that they look for. It's either sex, drugs, or money. So when you have a money motive, that's an interesting one. And they were getting into some big stuff. He was just a carpenter who sold kitchen sinks for 20 years, and then he was getting into a $2 million purchase of a vineyard and stuff, and that went crazy. So he was a little family that had been scouts and cubs and just did normal things, got into a wine drinking crew, and then obviously tried to do a property development which went west. So you have that issue, and so from my perspective, it seems there's a lot of anger for what had happened, which, from the business perspective, once the guy had got his money, you sort of wonder why they would then have that upset and carry on over to their house there. So it, comes back to what are the other options. The simplest one from a Lundy perspective would have been if the person that committed suicide 5 or 6 days later after the murders had been more well investigated with regards to that, rather than if there was to be a person in prison who pleaded innocence. So that would have then been able to tie it up. So obviously a third trial is preferable, and with Parol in 2022, this is still a relevant case. So my feelings on it is that a Governor General, it's time for the government to ask for a pardon and to do the Arthur Allen Thomas, and then have a Royal Commission of Enquury into what had happened. So the public need to have that level. Muldoon has set that as 160 IQ, and they need to go forward in the similar process. So the Governor General, I'm asking you as a New Zealand citizen to look into pardoning Lundy and asking for a Royal Commission into the techniques and the forensic side, so that we can have a much better justice system in New Zealand, where we focus on hairs and fingerprints and following up motives that may involve money, and that would be the way that I would progress with this. So essentially it's like a third trial where he's pleaded not guilty, but a pardon and a compensation package for his time inside, and then a Royal Commission to go through the process of what's happened. So that's 2021 November. Thank you very much. Rod Young reporting on this, and thanks very much for the person that gave the update and just printed. There's a 2-part series. That was a part of the second part, and there's, you can see on the screen the link to that, and you can follow that report up yourself. Thank you very much.